And good afternoon or evening as the Spirit has moved you to join us. Welcome to our week 27 discussion of our effort to read through the Chronological Bible in 1 year. This is July 2nd through July 8th. We are reading various prophecies of Isaiah as well as the historical record from approximately 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 7 through 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 8, as well as 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 22, and through 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 21. The prophecies of Isaiah are presented not necessarily in the order in which they appear in the Bible. They are presented in the order in which our editor, F. LaGard Smith, believes, and with not just guesswork, but based on hints in the Scripture itself, when he believes these prophecies were created, written down by Isaiah. Now, I'm sure there are detractors who will say, well, those were all written down after the events, but I don't think that's accurate. I believe that the prophecies that we're going to discuss initially were written down before the events being prophesied. And those initial prophecies that we read at the early part of our reading for the week are prophecies about the fall of nations around Israel. And now remember, at this point in history, Israel and Judah are two separate entities. Israel has a capital in Samaria, and Judah has their capital in Jerusalem. So Isaiah prophesies that both Tyre and Sidon and Phoenicia, he mentions all three of those, are to fall. And that is the region kind of west and somewhat north of Israel and is pretty much modern-day Lebanon. He similarly prophesies that the Philistines will fall. And he says in that, or I would note that in that he is prophesying about the country south of Lebanon, modern-day Gaza Strip area. And then finally, in these early sections, he discusses Babylon. And I would like to read a portion of that passage from Isaiah 13, verses 17 through 22. See, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no money, no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. This is a particularly, what would I call it, insightful prophecy, because at this point, Babylon is not really even a threat. And yet, he is prophesying the fall of Babylon under attack by the Medes, and ultimately that is what happens. The Medo-Persian Empire takes control of the Babylonian Empire, and that's years away. So we are at approximately 730 BC historically. Ahaz is the king of Judah, and Ahaz is promoting the fall of Aram because Aram is trying to overthrow Israel, i.e. Samaria. So Ahaz involves Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria in an effort to form an alliance strong enough to definitely repel Aram. Well, needless to say, that means he becomes a vassal of Assyria. Judah also becomes Judah becomes a vassal of Assyria, and Ahaz builds an altar like the one he observed in Damascus, which strangely enough is the capital of Aram, the Syrian capital. And he's sacrificing God to the gods of Aram. So he forms a vassal relationship with Assyria, and he sacrifices to Aram's gods. Sad story. Possibly, here's some better news, possibly about 725 BC, Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, becomes king of Judah, and he reigned relatively righteously for 29 years in Jerusalem. He started by opening the temple, which had more or less been allowed to be abandoned, and he had the Levites reconstruct the temple and resume offerings and dedications in the temple in Jerusalem. And he invited all of Israel, anybody in Israel who wished to participate, to join in the Passover celebration. Meanwhile, Hoshea, the king of Israel, makes Israel also a vassal state to Assyria. So now both Judah and Israel are vassals to Assyria. However, Hoshea tries to establish a back-channel relationship with Egypt, thinking that Egypt's strong enough to overcome Assyria. Well, Shalmaneser V of Assyria discovers this backdoor relationship with Egypt, and that's the end. That's the beginning of the end for Israel. Shalmaneser sent his army to Israel and conquered much of it, and then laid siege to Samaria, the capital. And after a 3-year siege in about 722 BC, Samaria fell to the Assyrians. Now, this is the start of an interesting period in what happens to Israel. After the fall of Assyria, Shalmaneser had all of the important people and many of the not so important people sent as captives to other areas of Assyria. They were deported from their homes in Israel and forced to move into places in Assyria. And Assyrians from other places were brought in to Israel, into what was then Israel. And I'd like to read several passages in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 21 through 26. When he, Jeroboam it's speaking of, tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled Samaria, them in towns of Samaria, to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord. So he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, quote, "The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires." This is quite a remarkable story, in my opinion anyway. And the long and short of what happens because of that story is that the people living now in Samaria, the people who are now living in Samaria, who have come from regions of around Israel, north and west primarily, so those people are now trying to learn about the Lord, and they have some success in doing that, and that's the start of the Sumerian worship, sort of like worshiping God, but doing so in Israel. And that fact will come to light when we're reading in the New Testament later. It'll be quite interesting. Anyway, it became what I would call a mixed religion. Roughly at the same time frame, remember, Hezekiah had become the king in Judah, and Hezekiah rebels against Assyria, and Judah is no longer a vassal state. Remember, Ahaz had made Judah a vassal, and now Hezekiah, his son, frees the country from the reigns of Assyria. Hezekiah, and why was that successful? Because Hezekiah had reopened the temple and had reinstated true worship of God in Judah. Hezekiah's armies defeated the Philistines, who had already been prophesied by Israel to be destroyed by Assyria, and they will be further destroyed. Hezekiah remained faithful to God for most of his reign. As usual, of course, power corrupts, and power corrupts absolutely. So at the end, he was less faithful, but nonetheless, this is sort of a pleasant period in Judah's history and the end of Israel's history as a nation following God. So with that, we are done with week 27. We will press on to week 28, where we'll read more prophecies of Isaiah. We look forward to meeting together again.